You're listening to The Cultured Bumpkin, a literature podcast with Jake Phillips, where we present audiobook quality readings of the classics for your enjoyment. Thank you for stopping by. And remember, just because you're a bumpkin doesn't mean you can't be cultured. Hello and welcome to The Cultured Bumpkin. I'm Jake. Now, in this episode, we're going to go over a story that is I had never heard before till I read it in this book. I don't know that it's common knowledge. I read lots of history books, and I've never read this before. I thought it was very interesting, and I wanted to share it with you. And it comes from the Old West in the 1850s in California. Now, in order to understand the United States of America, like any country, you need to understand the history of it. And to understand the history, you got to read the history. So in this book, Time Life Books series called The Old West. Now, maybe you have some, or your grandparents have some, or you've seen them. They're not in print anymore that I know of, but I love those things. And there's a story in here that I want to read to you. And it's about the Battle of the Weaverville Tongs. Now, we're about to hear what a tong is. It has nothing to do with salad. All right? And these kind of stories are what help you understand a place like America. I love this kind of stuff anytime I'm reading about the history of, the British Isles or, the Germanic peoples or anybody in Europe or in, Africa or the Far East. I love little small stories like this. They add so much character, right? And anyway, let's jump into it. So, it's gold rush season, right? 1849 was the big gold rush in California, and so that brought a lot of people out west. People came from the eastern part of the United States out west. So a lot of Chinese people came over. They heard about the gold, and they wanted to come pan for gold, and then they ended up getting into business. So anyway, a lot of guys were not only there looking for gold from the Far East, but they started business ventures. Interestingly enough, caveat, I keep rabbit trailing, my bad. Several years later on the railroad, you had, when they were building the Transcontinental Railroad, you had the Union Pacific, and they left like Council Bluff, Iowa, came through Omaha, and they were coming across the plains. It was nice and flat, and they were just making miles and miles at a time. They had Irishmen, they had Germans, they had Confederate soldiers, right, that had fought in the Civil War. They had Union soldiers that had fought in the Civil War. They had freed slaves. They had so many people that it was like a tinderbox. So people were always getting in fights, all kind of stuff on these, on the work crew that was going east or from the east headed west, right? There was houses of ill repute, right? The guys would get drunk every night and show up the next day. They would get, hungover to work. The drinking filthy water out of ditches and getting dysentery and being off work from that. And anyway, those guys going west were, there's a lot of problems that went along with it. The Sacramento portion that came from Sacramento through the mountains, so it was much more rocky, so it was a lot slower progress, but they were, blowing up tunnels and stuff. A lot of them were Chinese. Now, Chinese are hard workers. They keep to themselves. They generally aren't fighting after getting liquored up in the middle of the night after a hard day's work before another hard day's work tomorrow. They would work hard and then go sit by the fire. And another thing they do, boil water for their tea. So they weren't getting sick like the white guys and the other Americans that were just like drinking it out of a filthy hoof print or whatever. So on to the Battle of the Weaverville Tongs. So it says, among the miscellany of men scrambling for gold in the diggings of California were thousands of Chinese who had fled from a series of famines in their homeland during the 1840s. Most of them clung to their habits and traditions that they brought over with them, including their baggy shirts, wide straw hats, a language the other miners found impenetrable, and the propensity for gathering into clannish fraternal organizations called Tongs. Virtually every gold camp seemed to have its own Tong, or two or more, depending on the size of the Eastern contingent, the Chinese guys in that area. If there was a bunch of them, there might be more than one Tong. Basically, these Tongs served as congenial refuges where a lonely man could find a friend or perhaps help in getting work or lodging. Sometimes, however, they hardened into reservoirs of old country prejudice, where old hatreds were nurtured and old feuds flared anew. In the summer of 1854, for example, denizens of the normally placid Chinatown in Weaverville, California, suddenly began ordering medieval weapons, custom-made by the local blacksmiths. 15-foot pikes. That's a spear. A 15-foot spear. If you're a blacksmith, put yourself in their hiking boots, right? You're a blacksmith, and a little Chinese guy comes in. He may not even speak English, but he communicates to you that he wants you to build him a 15-foot spear. Would you get suspicious? Like, what do you need a 15-foot spear for, man? Now, if his buddy came in 5 minutes later and ordered one, and then another buddy came in, you would really start to wonder what's going on. So they ordered 15-foot pikes, 5-foot swords, giant pronged spears. The Smiths flashed the word to the white community. So they're like, hey, I don't know what's going on, but these Chinese guys, they are ordering weapons that they don't need for farming or whatever work they were doing. These are war weapons. They're swords and stuff. The Smiths flashed the words to the white community. Weaverville's two Tongs were going to war. Why? No one could say. But a fight, and it would be a big one, was surely coming. On July 15th, carrying spears and swords at shoulder arms, the two forces marched into a large field, followed by 2,000 cheering townspeople. I don't know what it is about Americans. Maybe people are like this around the world, but Americans like a fight. In the first Battle of Bull Run was a spectator sport. They thought it would be quick and painless, and the Union would trample the Confederates, and the war would be over in a few minutes. And so there was families coming out on the hillsides and spreading out picnic blankets and having lunch. I don't know what it is. We just think that's interesting. I guess we've always been that way. The 150 men of one Tong wore red hats. Their opponents, 400 strong, carried a banner inscribed Canton City Company. To the clang of gongs and the bang of drums, red hats and Cantons charged ferociously at one another, stopped dead, ran off, and then went through the whole menacing drill all over again. So they were doing these false charges, run at each other, screaming, banging gongs, and then stop, go back, and do it again. So nobody was getting hurt yet. Finally, an exasperated young Swede fired his pistol into the ranks. That touched off 10 minutes of frenzied fighting that ended, to everyone's astonishment, in the pell-mell retreat of the numerically superior Cantons. Remember, they had 400 to the Red Hats having only 150. After the dust had settled and the casualties were carried off, the townspeople discovered the inspired strategy by which the Red Hats' puny force managed to win the day. It seemed that their leader, a natural military genius known only as Charlie, had secretly engaged some of the spectators to cover his troops' exposed rear once they had broken the Canton front. The plan worked. Split by a Red Hat charge and blocked by the Whites from closing ranks, the Cantons fled, leaving 8 dead and 6 wounded on the field. Also found, to no one's particular regret, was the body of the battle-hungry Swede, shot in the head by an unknown party. Next day, the Chinese buried their dead. The Tongs did not reveal what had caused the dispute, but whatever it was had apparently been settled, for the two sides never fought again. Interesting. The short, unhappy war of the Weaverville Tongs. I had never heard of that, and now I have, and now you have too, if you haven't heard of it before. So, interesting stuff. America is a wild place, and it always has been, and I suppose always will be. If you enjoyed this, I hope that you'll subscribe to wherever you're hearing it. And I really appreciate you listening. You've been listening to The Cultured Bumpkin, a literature podcast with Jake Phillips. Thank you very much for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, would you mind going and subscribing and leaving a nice review on whatever podcast platform you heard this on? I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.